just rumours. Nothing happened with me. I only fight real fighters, people that actually fight, you know what I mean?
Holy shit. What the hell was that all about?
Moicano wants money! Money!
Look at this face!
Fucking turtle. Ninja turtle.
Hold on, I'm talking about
The defendant's rights as a conscientious objector are protected by an act of Congress.
New chapter in your life. I back. Trust me, I back.
Tony El Kukui Ferguson, the whirling dervish of blades and shades.
Hold on, I'm talking, brother.
A man who had put fear in the hearts of every man brave enough to step in the lightweight division during his heyday. The boogeyman, the Ninja Turtle.
Ninja turtle.
The Boat, that's the greatest of all time, tied owner of the longest win streak of said division, and a former interim title holder, a man who, without a doubt, will go down as one of the most loved fan favourite fighters of all time, and rather unfortunately, a man who is now riding a 6-fight losing skid, the inevitable, mutilated swan song that veterans waltz into retirement to. Tony would slash, mangle, and disfigure his opponents inside of the cage, their faces dripping warm streaks of glistening ruby, their faces immortalized in chatboards and memes as fans hail the PTSD-inducing destruction Ferguson brutalizes his foes with. Side by side, his victims' post-fight faces look like a Pinterest board curated by Ed Gein himself. The thing was, Tony was notorious for being a slow starter, a man who would pick up the pace throughout his fights until the pressure would become overwhelming, a trickle into a flash flood as it were, his cardio a formidable enemy against his wilting dance partner. But there was one thing that was required to bring Tony into his second phase, and that was a swift punch to his cranium. See, Tony had a knack for getting dropped in almost all of his fights, but as if a Dark Souls character himself, El Kukui would arise from the knockdown, a new song swelling amidst the chaos. And Ferguson arises anew, the knockdown, a waking call to that inner savage that haunted the lightweight division for so long. His opponents would now be subjected to a barrage of violence until surrender. During his awe-inspiring win streak, there was not one man who knocked down Tony Ferguson and lived to tell the tale. And so the myth goes, one of the most mythical of them all, Second Phase Ferguson, a legend that still echoes in the division he once ruled over. Moicano had amassed a win streak that would make most in the featherweight rankings exploit their 3 fights a year clause to avoid fighting him. A spectacular undefeated 11-fight winning streak, Renato looked to cement his place in the top 10 and would find himself matched up against another undefeated featherweight, pre-CTE Ortega. The UFC matchmakers in all their cruelty and thirst for bloodshed would lock the two unblemished warriors into the cage together to determine whose O had to go. In an origin story to fuel any mythical beast, Moicano would be choked out in the 3rd round of a fight that he was looking extremely good in. This would start a series of hit or miss performances that would ultimately see him headed to lightweight in an attempt to rejuvenate his declining career. But again, he would swing between wins and losses. Moicano would suffer a brutal back and forth loss against Rafael dos Anjos, which was made especially egregious considering Moicano had taken the fight on 5 days' notice. The UFC would give Moicano a great matchup against Brad Riddell as a reward for his sacrifice that night, a man who Renato would ultimately squeeze the life out of. It is here in the ecstasy of victory that a new mythical fighter would be manifested in all its fleshy glory. Financially motivated Moicano, a man who would utter the sacred vow of the secret Just Bleed Brotherhood. Moicano wants money, a simple yet poignant notion, a man who had given up everything to wage war in the Octagon, a man who had shown more heart and talent during his UFC tenure than most, now simply wanted one thing: to be paid what his sporting butchery was worth, and I think that he had earned it. Whilst Moicano had uttered these most sacred words earlier in his career, it wasn't until this time, where he screamed it at the top of his lungs, did the MMA gods truly bestow the newly minted mythical fighter with that divine energy to transcend his opponents. Now riding a 3-fight win streak, Moicano, financially motivated, soars higher up the rankings toward his ultimate payday, bringing along with him a boatload of new fans.
There's something about the Brazilian accent, you know what I mean? When they speak English, just makes it way funnier. Moicano wants money! It's Moicano wants money! I was fucking drinking beers.
Moicano went from rags to riches. He made his dreams come true. But if you aren't having dreams, then how can you achieve them? Well, today's sponsor helps with that first part, Manta Sleep. I've slept with this sleep mask for years, and as someone who works night shifts a few days every month, it's been super important to have something wrapped around my eyes. The problem is that either one, they don't block out the light and I get woken up by the midday sun, or I wake up and I'll find that the mask is magically transported to the other side of the bedroom. The first issue is solved by Manta Sleep's eyepieces, which put zero pressure on your eyes, but also perfectly seals out any light. The eyepieces are completely adjustable to your face, which just adds to the comfort of the mask. It allows you to get a truly blacked out night's sleep, blacker than being transported to the shadow realm courtesy of an uppercut from Francis Ngannou. The second feature that I absolutely love is just how secure and comfortable they are on my face. I'm a side sleeper, so these angled eyepieces are perfect. But I also don't know what voodoo Manta Sleep is blessing these Velcro bits with, but it has to be the most strongest and reliable mask I've worn, never falling off my face. Using this mask, I've had the best night's sleep over the last month, and there is no way I'm going back. Another great feature about these masks is the ability to machine wash them. You can tuck them away in this little bag and throw them into the washing machine and get rid of all your nighttime tears produced from watching Dustin fail another title shot. You can get all the different masks that are available to you by checking out Manta Sleep by using the link in the description and pinned comment. Make sure that you use code ACADEMIC for 10% off your order. Cody Garbrandt entered the UFC as an undefeated prospect. Hailing from the sacred halls of Team Alpha Male, Cody had behind him perhaps the finest and most important gym of its time for the lower weight classes. Uriah Faber, the gym's owner, had pulled him onto the squad after a promising wrestling career in high school and had crafted him to become a devastating force in the bantamweight division. Honing his striking skills and perfecting his ground game, his talent was obvious from the start, knocking out all of his opponents on his way into the UFC, and would continue in fashion, notching 5 more wins, 4 of which were finishes into his record. Along the way, he would use his mentor's long and fabled rivalry with Dominic Cruz as a platform to put forward his own bid for a chance to claim the title, and whilst his ranking after dispatching Mizugaki was less than desirable and more than likely undeserving of a title shot, his potential star power overshadowed the objections. Cody looked and talked the part, and already young in his career drew in the numbers. Those performances only solidified the fact that the UFC thought they had another Conor McGregor on their hands, and so the matchup was put together. The young 25-year-old and relatively inexperienced Cody Garbrandt would be taking on the consensus bantamweight GOAT Dominic Cruz, a crafty and wise veteran who understood the game better than anyone. The thing that people didn't know, though, was that Cody was driven by some otherworldly force. Maddox Maple had been battling leukemia for 2 years as it ravaged his body, countless cycles of chemotherapy, leaving sores in his mouth and down his throat the size of quarters. It was no surprise that he had finally had enough. He didn't want to fight anymore. The crushing tide of relentless therapy had drowned any last semblance of hope. He wanted to die. But his family, desperate for their dying son to carry on the most heroic fight, decided to call in the help of a local undefeated fighter to help him in the battle. That's when a young Cody Garbrandt would enter Maddox's life, and the two immediately bonded. See, Cody had been battling his own demons with mental health at the time, and seeing Maddox have his life taken away, but not by choice, reminded the bantamweight that life was not to be taken for granted. And so they made each other a pact, a promise made between two warriors, an inescapable bond tied together by an almost unattainable dream. If Maddox promised to beat cancer, then Cody would promise to become a UFC champion. And well, years later the two would keep that promise. Maddox had entered remission, and on the night of December 30th, 2016, Cody would keep up his end of the bargain.
Garbrandt said more than once he has been targeting Dominic Cruz since he was in high school.
I like how he keeps switching stances as well, Mike. Boy, oh, goodness! Cruz is back up, at least for now.
Undisputed UFC bantamweight champion of the world.
What can you do, man? I mean, this is part of it, is losing, and part of life is losing. I think everybody here can say one time or another, maybe not in a fight, but you felt like a loser. And how do you come back from it? Let's see, I know myself. I've lost before.
Cody had seemingly done the impossible, becoming one of the youngest UFC competitors to claim a title, defeating the consensus bantamweight GOAT as an undefeated prospect, and all the while fulfilling an impossible pact with a boy who had given up on life. Two men from the very bottom of what life can offer had risen to the pinnacle, a tale of grit, determination and will. Is one of those stories that resonates with anyone willing to hear it, and one that has unfortunately often been lost on UFC fans. It had shown that beneath that brash and rough exterior of Garbrandt lay a heart of a true champion, a man willing to elevate those around him through love, respect and courage. But that man who had finally fulfilled Team Alpha Male's prophecy was about to have a fall to match that meteoric rise. Cody had finalized that deep and meaningful pact with Maddox, fulfilling that impossible dream, and in some ways, it signified the end of a journey of sorts. That man who had outclassed the division's GOAT would live and die in the Octagon that fateful night of the 30th. Cody would be quickly matched up against TJ Dillashaw, a former teammate, and a man who was also wanting to lay claim to the title of the greatest bantamweight of all time. Their incredible rivalry is something I have extensively covered in 3 videos, so it's not something I will go over again. All you need to know is that the Cody that showed up on December 30th, 2016 was never seen again. His hot-headedness outside of the cage would leak in through the splits of the chain-linked fence, and his temper got the best of him, leaving TJ to capitalize, knocking him out in the second round, something that just a year later he would repeat with a first-round knockout, and from there, Cody's career would never be the same again, picking up wins in between devastating losses, back and forth and across multiple divisions, from number 1 in the world to no longer even ranked. It's a sad decline that unfortunately we see all too often, but Cody will always be remembered for the performance that many consider the greatest of all time in a title fight by a challenger, and so the legend is that no man or woman could ever have defeated Cody Garbrandt on the fateful night of the 30th of December 2016.
Cody Garbrandt, the night he beat Dominic Cruz and became the world champion, in my opinion, is the best 135-pound fighter the world has ever seen. I do not believe there has ever been another fighter that could beat the Cody that beat Dominic that night. I think he's the best. Now, how long you can say, if you become the best, if you're the best at anything in the world, better than everybody else on earth for one day, it's amazing. Of course, you would like to keep it and hold it, but there will never be a time that Cody wants to be done with this sport. There, of course, will be a time when Cody wakes up and this sport's done with him.
Much to the pleasure of incels, it was announced that standout strawweight talent Mackenzie Dern was getting a divorce from her professional surfing husband Wesley Santos, but their twisted joy of Dern being on the market would be short-lived, as it was revealed that the divorce had come as the result of domestic violence, with Dern being the victim, a horrible circumstance and something that she quite rightly should never be on the receiving end of. This was all happening during a time where she would be headlining a UFC event in May of 2023 against Angela Hill. As you can imagine, the pressure of not only preparing for a fight inside of the 8-walled cage of interlocked steel, but also the unimaginable stress of getting a divorce was something that made Dern consider throwing in the towel altogether. But as our favourite modern philosopher Israel Adesanya once said, pressure makes diamonds. Dern was fighting for more than just pride inside of the Octagon. She was doing this to earn money, to pay off lawyers, to feed her children, to put a roof over their heads, and to finally shed that sickly skin of an abusive husband. She took all that energy into the cage and beat the snot out of Angela Hill, winning a dominant unanimous decision victory and earning a fight of the night bonus. The fight was an absolute barn burner, and both ladies decided that night they would feast on CTE and nosebleeds, swinging wildly at each other in a woman's showdown for the ages. She would later say in an interview, "I was unleashing my anger. It was not only emotion, of course, I was motivated. I needed to win. I needed a bonus. I needed all the money I could get because of everything I was going through. All of that, and my desire to win because I was coming off of a loss. I had anger. I was letting it all out. But I also evolved this camp. The motivation in this fight was everything I'm going through. The divorce, my ex-husband. I wouldn't call it a new Mackenzie, but an evolved Mackenzie. Quickly, rumors of a new mythical fighter began circulating the streets of combat, whispers of a divorced Dern. She was evolved. Like most mythical fighters on this list, she had become infused with some unidentified energy gushing forth from the ether.
3.0, you've been very open about this new chapter in your life, and there's like this like new aggression in you that you're just like going out there to kill everyone. So I feel like this is like the third version, at least in MMA, that we've seen of you. Are you okay with this?
Yeah. I'm hoping this is the version that gets me to the belt. So I hope we get to 3. But I mean, hey, maybe after we get the belt, then we'll go to like a 4.0 or something like
Sure.
that, like the champion, defense Mackenzie,
But also, like many mythical fighters, they are gone in but a blink of an eye. Dern is now on a 2-fight skid, but that is what makes this mythical fighter so special. She came, and then she went, like tears in the rain. The Korean Zombie flew to the top of the featherweights in the UFC after the merger with the WEC. In his first fight in the premier organization, Zombie would spectacularly pull off the first ever twisted submission in UFC history, a submission so incredibly rare that we have only seen it twice more since, Bryce Mitchell and Damon Blackshear securing them accordingly. It speaks to the incredible ground game that Young had, but it is in this very fight with Leonard Garcia where the world got to see just where Zombie got his nickname from. Before the twister finish, the fight was an absolute barn burner on the feet, and despite the hellfire that came Zombie's way, he would stumble onward, relentless in his bid to claim victory. The fact that it ended in such a way just solidified Young's incredible survivability and heart, and ultimately, his place in the division. Zombie would keep up his run in the UFC by earning himself a performance of the night knockout in just 7 seconds against Mark Hominick, one of the fastest in UFC history. Now with back-to-back unheard of performances, Zombie was catapulted into a title eliminator fight with none other than Dustin the Diamond Poirier. But this wasn't salon quality hair Poirier. The Louisiana native would be choked out in the 4th round by an impressive Darce choke that would get Young not only submission of the night, but submission of the year. In just 3 fights over the course of a calendar year, Zombie had earned himself the first title shot of his career. The problem standing in his way was the formidable champion Jose Aldo, a man who would ultimately finish the Zombie in the 4th round, leaving him devastated and injured. Zombie would return home, saddened by the loss, and it is here where he would have to commit 2 years of his life to his home country's national service, 2 years in the South Korean army. Because he was injured, he was granted a clerical role in the city, but because of the hours he had to work, he was unable to train to the standard he had over the last decade. We wouldn't see Young for a rather frustrating 4 years. 4 years in which he slowly slipped from his spot as the #1 contender in the division. It was a sad time to say the least, but in late 2016, his return was booked. Zombie would make up for all the lost time, knocking out top 10 ranked Dennis Bermudez in the 1st round, and would carry on that momentum by edging out Yair Rodriguez in a back and forth 5-rounder. Well, that was until the very last second of the fight. Yair, out of pure desperation and creativity, would unleash one of the wildest knockouts the sport would ever see, back elbowing the Zombie in a last-ditch effort and coming away the victor. Young would reflect on the loss a few days later, releasing a rather devastating Instagram post stating, "I do not have an excuse. I am so sorry to all of you that helped me. Thank you. Congratulations to those who hate me. I have to be in the hospital for a few days. I have not been able to get on the plane yet. I'm ashamed." It was tough to hear a fighter be so negative after such an incredible performance, and if anything, that fight will forever be etched into the history books. It was certainly nothing to be ashamed of. Despite being so close once more to a title, Young would have to go back to the drawing board, coming back the following year and getting 2 incredible performance of the night knockouts against top-ranked opponents in Frankie Edgar and Renato Moicano, once again sparking hopes of a title shot. But in a cyclical tale, Zombie would be shunted back down the rankings in a battle of the Mythical Fighters when he took on accursed Bold Ortega. Ortega's return to the sport was masterful, leaving Zombie once again distant from the title. After taking just under a year off to recover, Zombie would come back with a dominant performance against Dan Ige, a win that was secured in such a time when the featherweight division was in dire straits. Bold Volk and accursed Bold Ortega and no sparring Holloway, mythical fighters in their own right, had just culled all contenders in the division, meaning that, coming off just 1 win and a legacy of violence, the Korean Zombie was granted his 2nd title shot, but it was a shutout. Volk dominated the fight in a brutal and bloody beatdown, a fight that symbolized every single reason Young was known as the Zombie. He walked forward through the barrage of brutality coming his way until the bitter end, being TKO'd still standing in the 4th round. Zombie, unfortunately, was past his prime, granted a title shot too late in his career. And it was that gap during his prime, due to military service, where he was ranked #1 in the world, that leaves such a bitter taste in the mouth of fight fans. It raises the fundamental question: if Zombie had not been forced to withdraw from his MMA career quite literally in his prime, what would have his legacy looked like? It's a timeline that we unfortunately will never get to experience, but in some other universe, there is a Zombie that was a conscientious objector, one who had carried on fighting during those precious years, and who knows, perhaps won a title in that absence. The Zombie in our timeline was granted one last fight, one last chance to prove not only to himself but the world whether he still had it. But it was a fight in which he would be outclassed. Zombie, true to every fibre of his being, would go out the way he came in, ever violent and ever courageous.
In a time long ago, there was a McGregor who tore through the featherweight division on his way to double championship opportunity. And on the way, he collected skulls of legends of the sport. His fighting style was just so hot. Electric, captivating, and entertaining is what I meant. He would chop the block off his unsuspecting opponents, and he was a true illusionist of distance and range. His opponents would become mesmerized by his subtle feints, and many would be lulled into a trance just before they got deported back to the shadow realm from which they came. Karate Stance McGregor was a man to be feared, and his stance was pretty interesting for someone who favored his hands. But it was this same interesting and unorthodox stance that allowed him to have so much MMA success. I mean, after all, how many MMA training partners out there could stand and mimic McGregor? I'd imagine very few. While the style was puzzling for some, the logic behind McGregor's movement was very straightforward. His wide stance allowed for smooth, dynamic movement in and out of range. And that's not even mentioning McGregor's 74-inch wingspan that gave him a massive advantage at featherweight. As we know now, that man who had achieved double champ success with his signature style would find himself pushed in a brand new direction: boxing. While that side quest would secure him generational wealth, it did very little for his fighting style in regards to his MMA career. When he returned to the sport years later, things just weren't the same. He would actually go on to narrow his stance and plant his feet more in order to throw more powerful punches. This move away from his original style of bounding in and out that made him so elusive showed that he was clearly infatuated with boxing. We'd go on to see bits and pieces of that old multifaceted game plan in his Dustin trilogy, but unfortunately, as we all know now, his leg would snap due to damage taken during his camp, most likely a product of his legs not being conditioned as they once were before. And that is the life and death of Karate Stance McGregor, a true tragedy of the sport.
Life is full of coincidences, but perhaps there is a design beyond our comprehension. A web of fate that we are not privy to. Well, Drew Dober's slew of success after suffering back-to-back losses to Islam Makhachev and Brad Riddell would quickly be hailed as that of mysticism. See, Dober is a vet of the UFC despite his young age, competing since 2013 in the premier organization, and whilst he had orbited the top 15, he had always managed to find himself getting shunted out in important fights that would allow him to progress to the top echelon of the division. Well, in 2022, Dober would start what would be a streak of finishes that have since come to be known as Drew Dober's racially motivated culling of the lightweights. And I got to say, the next two entries have a slight racial undertone to them, and I was really trepid about including them in this video, but ultimately I've decided that 1, I never actually came up with these names or these concepts, all of you fuckers did, and 2, I don't actually think there's anything racist about them. It's just, as I say, simply a coincidence that people have picked up on and turned this into a meme. So I want to make it clear that these are memes that I'm talking about and not something I personally came up with. So who exactly is racially motivated Drew Dober? It has become apparent that after some soul-searching post-defeat, he would come back to take on Terrence McKinney, whom he would destroy, followed by Rafael Alves, and finally would crush Bobby Green in a 3-fight winning streak against people who most definitely are not Caucasian. It was something I believe the guru spoke upon and has since sprouted into a meme. Unfortunately, the UFC had had enough of Drew destroying their minority fighters and sentenced him to death against the whitest, palest man they had, Matt Frivola. In a Macbeth-esque tragedy, ginger is not a race, and the mythical fighter known as racially motivated Dober would come to an end. A fighter so heaven-sent, I doubt will be graced with its majesty again. But for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Energies in harmony, in a dance that creates equilibrium. And in much the same way, mythical energies push and pull at the seams of what is possible. For every racially motivated win that Dober notched into his legacy, Gustafsson, the Viking of Sweden, had already manifested years earlier quite the opposite. Alexander, the blue-eyed warrior, was a formidable foe when he graced the Octagon with an almost 100% finishing rate, and going 15-1 as a pro, his only defeat at the hands of Phil Davis. Guss would find himself knocking on the door of MMA GOAT John Jones, the then current reigning and defending light heavyweight champion of the world. In that fight, Guss would take the seemingly invincible-looking king to the toughest decision of his career to date, a decision in which many felt could have gone either way, leaving Guss walking out the Octagon empty-handed of the treasure he so desperately coveted and a second loss on his record. But a theme, a pattern, a rhyme was beginning to become apparent. A curse, perhaps. It was said that Alex could only be beaten by men of a certain ilk, seemingly confirmed by his next two devastating losses, both to Anthony Johnson and Daniel Cormier. Alex would then fight his way back to championship opportunity by defeating Polish monster Jan and Brazilian hero Glover, but it was again John Jones who stopped his winning ways, and thus the legacy of white opponent Guss was born, a man who balances the racially motivated game of Dober, and a man whose kryptonite is men of a specific race.
Chandler is a vet of the game, competing since 2009 and along the way collecting the Bellator Lightweight World Championship multiple times and the skulls of many of his opponents. But what you'll notice at a quick glance at his record is that many of his wins come in the first round, explosive and devastating knockouts against top caliber athletes. And another apparent thing is that many of his losses take place after that opening round. You see, that savage that owns the opening 5 minutes begins to fade at the coming of the second round. It's not completely over, but he is most definitely not the same. The lactic acid would build up in his stocky frame, and those calculated explosions known for destroying his opponents become wild haymakers of desperation, his mouth wide open and his diaphragm struggling. And while he can still go on to win rounds, you'd have to ask the same question your girlfriend secretly thinks about you. What if he could last more than 5 minutes?
He's kicking the leg of a determined individual who's going to come down his throat.
If Chandler could keep up those freaky athletic and fast performances for 5 rounds straight, would he be a world champion again? Maybe, but perhaps that's more of a question for zigged instead of zagged Chandler. Regardless, the man known for nearly knocking out Oliveira, beating up Dan like he was a different kind of hooker, and sending Patricky Pitbull to the Shadow Realm all inside 1 round will forever remain mythical. But let's see how he compares to the next fighter on this list.
Oh, we're gonna do this? We're gonna fight right now? We're gonna fight right now? Oh, we're gonna do this? We're gonna fight right now?
Before his entrance into the UFC, Askren was hailed as the greatest what-if the sport had ever known. He had risen to Bellator champ within just 7 fights, a title that he would go on to defend 4 times, before moving over to Asia and competing for 1 championship, where he would also claim the welterweight championship and defend that 4 times, along the way amassing an amazing 18-0 record, a career in which was entirely dominant and impressive. So you may be asking the question, why the hell did he never make it to the UFC? Well, it seems that Dana and Askren didn't exactly see eye to eye. After defending his title for the last time in 2017, Askren would retire from the sport of MMA. His hips had been causing him a lot of pain, and so he decided it was time to hang up the gloves, and all that remained was the lingering question, just how good could have Askren been in the UFC? Well, Dana, 2 years later, made sure that we would find out. Askren made his debut against Robbie Lawler, a fight in which he would get a controversial submission win inside the first round. Askren would quickly be matched up with Jorge Masvidal for a fight to take place at UFC 239 in the summer of 2019, and that fight would promise violence and a pre-fight build-up for the ages.
You're fake as you're selling something to the public that is not there, obviously, and you're a coward. Let's throw that in there too. And if people don't believe me, tune in July 6th. I'll show you how much of a coward he is.
Yeah, they need to keep the idiot away from me. I mean, I'm paid to fight in the Octagon, and we can do it for 15 minutes, and I don't want any chances that he's gonna do something stupid before the fight and ruin it.
He just wants validation. He wants to be accepted, you know?
I think half of what he's doing is corny on purpose. All that boom roasted shit. Come on, man.
Boom roasted. Boom roasted. Boom roasted. There is no way in God's green earth this guy could do anything to me. It's totally impossible. I will do whatever I want to this person. I will dominate them. I will humiliate them.
So it's one of those, can he impose his will? Can he get a hold of you?
He's gonna get a hold of these fucking nuts.
Well, he's good. He's just not good enough.
All you guys are double leg.
What's up, boss?
Yeah, man. I can't wait. Thanks. I can't wait to break your face, baby.
We found out he's a specialist at putting his face in other men's crotch. So that's what we're gonna try to stop, is for him not to sniff my crotch the whole fight, you know?
His muscles aren't very big and his beard's pretty ugly. But besides that, I think it's gonna be total domination.
He doesn't upset me. I'm happy I'm gonna get paid to correct that mistake that is Ben Askren.
MMA is a tangle of destinies, an interwoven mesh of beautiful and intriguing possibilities. The interlinked cage promises fates to collide, one ultimately doomed, and the other to become infused with its energies. Nothing is created nor destroyed. As above, so below. Ben Askren, despite retirement, despite refusing to bow down to Dana, and despite the destruction of his hips, had made his way to the UFC, and with a win over Jorge, was guaranteed a title shot. Jorge, a journeyman who had returned from the jungle after a spiritual awakening, destroyed Darren Till in his hometown, and with a win over Askren, was also guaranteed a title shot. Ben had somewhat defined the first half of 2019. He was what everyone talked about. His fight with Jorge was unofficially the main event. Askren was the story, and in 5 seconds, all of that fame, hype, and promotional effort had transferred to Street Jesus himself. What amazed people even more in the aftermath was that Masvidal, in some mockery of reality, had manifested this moment, planting the seeds for a baptism over many encounters, and no one even caught it. All fight week, he had been putting his arms behind his back, a non-threatening gesture, one we had seen in London before he delivered a 3-piece and a soda. The simple fact was, it was a law, lulling his enemy into a false sense of safety, but underneath that guise was a plan, a sequence of synapse explosions etched into Jorge's nervous system. He had been drilling a flying knee throughout his fight camp. It was all a part of the plan. The fact that it paid off was truly unbelievable. There are no amount of words that can describe this moment. It was just simply perfect. 2 careers worth of hype, lows and highs, championships and backstreet brawls, and a trade for the ages, all on a crash course to the fastest knockout in UFC history. The aftermath was insane. That flying knee transcended the sport, billions of views, millions of gifs. Years later, and it remains in the zeitgeist of this sport. It was, and always will be, one of the greatest moments the sport had ever seen. Unfortunately, it was Ben Askren who was on the wrong side of that exchange. Jorge became a superstar, and Askren was placed at a divisive fork in the road, his hips eroding every fight camp, and the title just got even further away. Quick turnarounds in this sport never really end well. I never like them, especially following a brutal knockout, and well, for Ben, it was no different. He would face Maia toward the end of 2019, and after a back and forth fight with sloppy striking and great grappling transitions, Askren got caught in a rear naked choke and was put to sleep by Maia. In just a short year, Askren had gone from one of the greatest what-ifs in the sport to being on the receiving end of what amounted to 3 performances that painted Askren as a mid-tier fighter. The fact is, if Askren had dodged that knee, then more than likely, he would have ragdolled Jorge like every other wrestler who Masvidal has gone up against since, meaning he very much could have fought for a title and won it. Instead, he would find himself on a 2-fight skid into retirement, but his undefeated streak in those years pre-knee and pre-hip problems were truly mythical, making pre-knee Askren one of the most mythical to grace this sport. Holloway, over a long and historic reign at the top echelon of his sport, has carved a name for himself in the history books, with multiple records, from strikes landed to winning streaks, world titles, and a plethora of fight night bonuses. His performances never fail to impress in just how violent and spectacular they are, and whilst he has experienced a handful of losses in his career, they have always come at the hands of legends. From iconic moments to his fan-favorite easygoing personality, there is no doubt in my mind that Holloway will be talked about for centuries to come. Perhaps the most impressive thing about him is that he's managed to put himself in the discussion for mysticism multiple times. Originally feared through the sport when he was referred to as No Sparring Holloway, or to the myths of Zoom Holloway, the man himself has managed to add another moniker when it comes to discussing his majesty, and that is Pointing Holloway. It all started on the night of the 4th of June 2019, when he stepped in the cage against Ricardo Lamas at UFC 199. In the waning moments of the fight, one in which he was handily winning, the Hawaiian warrior would point to the floor and beckon Lamas to throw caution to the wind and engage in a slugfest. This complete disregard for the win about to come his way was considered one of the most badass moments to happen in this sport. Lamas would still lose, and Holloway, with the performance, had earned himself his first taste of leather and gold, going on to face Anthony Pettis. After many years reigning at the top of his division as the featherweight king, Holloway would be asked by the UFC to offer his services in the main event of UFC 236, a fight in which he would have an opportunity of gaining a second belt in a second division against Dustin Poirier. Whilst the fight would not go his way, he still, in the last 10 seconds, pointed to the ground and threw down against the diamond, showing once again how game he is for violence. Fast forward another couple of years, and now beltless after a trilogy of wars against featherweight icon Alexander Volkanovski, Max would headline a fight against British standout Arnold Allen. In a surprise to no one, he would outpoint the rising talent over the course of 5 rounds. But it was yet again in those closing seconds that Max decided he owed blood to the blood god and threw leather down the barrel. Once again at complete odds with victory and game planning, but in complete favour with bloodthirsty fans. After following up the impressive performance by retiring the Korean Zombie, Max would receive a fantastic matchup. The UFC 300 co-main event, if you will, a shot at the symbolic BMF title against the ever-violent and ever-entertaining Justin Gaethje. At first, many people were a bit disappointed that the often considered a gimmick belt would be up for grabs again, but Max would cement the belt's legitimacy by doing the most BMF thing this sport has ever known. It's extremely hard to put into words or to convey what the closing 10 seconds of this fight were. Max would point to the centre of the octagon, encouraging the heavy-handed knockout machine Gaethje to engage in a phone booth exchange, in a fight that once again Holloway was winning. Whilst asking to throw down against the likes of Arnold or Lamas is most likely dangerous, it's nothing compared to enticing the raging bull that is the Mexican-blooded brute that is Justin Gaethje. Well, in a scene that still astonishes me to this day, Holloway, in the very last millisecond, would sentence Gaethje's soul to eternal damnation in the bleak and somber darkness of the Shadow Realm. I sat there, speechless. It was the most insane thing I'd ever witnessed, and I think just about any fan of this space will agree, and so, never, ever attempt to lock horns with Pointing Holloway, one of the most feared and unpredictable mythical men to roam this land. There was a time before the tinkering of certain testing companies where fighters of all testosterone levels roamed free, alpha males allowed to grow into their full potential, whether that was through tainted horse meat or otherwise. Nothing was in the way of them reaching unnatural sizes. One such victim of the USADA cull that many people speculate was on the good stuff is the man himself, Johnny Hendricks, the fighter responsible for making GSP believe that he was abducted by aliens. A man who looks like he would repair your Dell laptop and go home to his trailer park. But before coming up against GSP, Johnny Big Rig was on an absolute tear. He was 15-1 and looked to be a future Hall of Famer with his near-perfect record. His fight with GSP, whilst a loss, was anything but in the eyes of fans. It is widely considered the greatest robbery this sport has certainly ever seen, but he would soon get redemption, claiming the welterweight strap in a back-and-forth barn burner with 5th round Robbie Lawler. Well then, like all good things, they come and they go. USADA came along and Johnny never looked the same again, losing 6 out of his next 8 and struggling with his weight cuts. From a near-perfect fighter and a champion, to sliding out of the rankings altogether, and so goes the legend of Juicy Hendricks, one of the very first mythical fighters, and the beast USADA destroyed, allegedly. Many consider Artem Lobov the GOAT of MMA for many reasons. A true man of the crucible, Artem is known for destroying all opponents who stay on his tracks.
Choo-choo, motherfuckers!
The Torso is a formidable opponent for just about any man on the planet. During his career, he would make a name for himself by destroying opponents in dominating and destructive fashion, and he has certainly Definitely not just the product of being Conor McGregor's best friend that was afforded every single opportunity given to him via osmosis of the Notorious One's infectious star power, and it's not like this gifted career would ever stop Artem from suing the man who gave him everything. Nope. Well, I want to let you in on a very secret pattern that has since been unearthed by the MMA community. The skeleton of this most mythical fighter, equal record Lobov. Here, look at this screenshot of his record from 2013 and onward. Here you will see, like all good things in the universe, Artem's most wonderful record would remain perfectly balanced for 4 years straight, never slipping out of sync by more than 1 degree. You could always, without a shadow of a doubt, guarantee that the MMA gods would return Artem's record to equilibrium.
I can call you a rat. Nah, 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 nah. Fuck.
Brock Lesnar had made a name for himself in the WWE, a superstar in his own right, a career that had been helped by his outstanding wrestling career throughout high school and college, where his athletic prowess and steroid use was on full display. He had always been a freak of nature, and thankfully, he had put his natural gifts to good use for the entertainment of wrestling fans worldwide. But for Brock, the WWE wasn't cutting it, and he decided that he would make a run in the UFC, proving that those who compete in the grueling sport of fake wrestling can cross over and compete in real fighting. And while considering USADA wasn't even a consideration at the time, Brock was free to massacre all those who stood in his way, quickly getting the heavyweight belt wrapped around his waist and defending it multiple times, proving to the world that he was indeed the baddest man on the planet. If he could keep the momentum going, well, who knows how many records he could smash and what kind of legacy he would leave behind, but it would soon all start falling apart. In November of 2009, Brock was diagnosed with monoculosis, and later in the month, it was discovered that he had a serious case of diverticulitis. Surgery was the only course of action for the superstar because this case was so severe and had gone undiagnosed for so long. But what is diverticulitis? It's a disease of the digestive tract, normally in the large intestine. On the colon of the patient, tiny pouches form. These pouches are called diverticular. When these pouches become inflamed, diverticulitis is diagnosed. Symptoms of the disease include fever, lower left abdominal pain, diarrhea, and nausea. Doctors are still unsure of what exactly causes diverticulitis. The current theory is that increased pressure in the large intestine can lead to the condition. The thought process goes on to say that a lack of fiber in the diet leads to increased pressure. On November 16, 2009, Lesnar underwent surgery for the condition. The surgeon had said that fecal matter was leaking into his abdominal cavity. This leakage was causing abscesses to develop, and it also forced Lesnar's immune system to work overtime. Lesnar had become very susceptible to other illnesses and infections because his immune system was focused exclusively on his abdominal cavity. Brock would make a full recovery from the surgery and would go on to defend his title against Shane Carwin after a year away from the sport. But just 4 months later, C-Level Kane would snatch the title, knocking Lesnar out in the first round. In May of 2011, diverticulitis would rear its ugly head once again, for which Lesnar would be rushed into surgery. This time, Brock would actually have a foot of his colon removed. Lesnar would ultimately leave the sport behind after a third loss in December of 2011, a fight in which Uberim targeted the abdomen of Brock, probably with the knowledge that that area was more than likely vulnerable. And so after a short career, of which most of it was spent at the top, Brock would leave his leather in the octagon, retiring, but forever leaving that question at the front of everyone's mind. Just how good was pre-diverticulitis Lesnar? It's hard to say where Brock would be if it wasn't for this most unfortunate of illnesses, and it's sad to see such an entertaining career get cut short via sickness. But one thing is for sure, pre-diverticulitis Lesnar is steeped in mysticism, and it is here where we will cap off this most mythical set of videos. This, unfortunately, is it for the series, and whilst many mythical fighters have been left on the cutting room floor, I feel like I've done this most important subsection of our community justice over the course of more than 2 hours of content. We have explored some of the most fearsome and interesting fighters this sport has spewed out, all set to the backdrop of Dark Souls and Elden Ring-esque lore videos. It's been an absolute honour to have done all of this with you guys, but it only makes sense to say goodbye to this series after the release of Shadow of the Erdtree. A fitting end, if you will. So thank you so much for watching, for what amounts to 1.5 million views on this series. A massive shout out to all the other MMA content creators who have helped fleshing out these mythical fighters' backstories. Now, if you don't mind me, I'm going to get consumed by Mesmer's flames. Goodbye, my friends. See you in the next one.
Don't use that, you motherfucker. Don't use that, you son of a bitch. Don't use that, you motherfucker. Don't use that.